everyone, and welcome to the Warp News Show. Our mission at the Warp Institute is, like our t-shirts, make the future come sooner, because we think there's a very decent chance the future is better than the present, and especially much better than the past. And I'm not just saying that because we're in the middle of a global pandemic. It's not super hard to create a better future than a global pandemic, but in more of a general sense, because we've seen some great progress for humanity over thousands of years, but especially in the last 300 years or so, and especially in the last few decades, we've seen some giant leaps forward for humanity. So we think there's a very good chance that the future always could be much better than the present. But of course, we can't just sit around and sort of wait for that future. It's not automatic. It's not through magic that the world is getting better, that humanity is getting better. It's because we create it. We make it better. We make the world better. And then, of course, it's a very good idea to understand what is progress. How do we create progress? How do we create good progress? How do we make the world better? If you want to make the future better, that's a good thing to understand. And that's the topic of Johan Norberg's latest book, Open, the Story of Human Progress. So we're going to talk about that topic and with Johan in just a minute. But first, I want to tell you briefly about us. My name is Mathias Sundin. I'm one of the founders of Warp Institute and Warp News. And we want to make people more optimistic about the future, as you might have guessed, because we see that a lot of people, especially in the richest part of the world, are very pessimistic about the future. And we think one big reason for that is that they read a lot of newspapers, and there's a huge negative bias in most newspapers, in most news out there. So we try to balance that with fact-based, optimistic news instead. So we create and spread that kind of content, that kind of news. So people, if they have a more optimistic view of the future, they can see all the opportunities, all the possibilities that are out there, and they can grab them. They get an optimist's edge over the pessimist who don't think everything is going to hell, because it's not. So if you want to support us in this mission, you can go to warpinstitute.org or warpinstitute.se if you're from Sweden. And you can sign up to become a premium supporter, or a WIP. That's VIP with a W, Warp Important Person. Like Johan, for example, he's one of them. So you support our work, and you'll get some knowledge from us and our experts. And the best part is all the people that are part of this network, a group of fantastic people. So please try that and sign up. You're most welcome. All right, let's dive into today's topic, and let's welcome today's guest on the Warp News Show, Johan Norberg. Welcome so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for your latest book. I read it over the weekend. I haven't got it in paper form yet, so I have it on my Kindle here. I read it over the weekend. This is your 20th book as an author or co-author, right?
Yeah, that's right. Time flies when you're having fun.
It sure does. So the first book I read from you was also, I think, your first sort of global bestseller in defense of global capitalism. That was a very important book for me. I think I read it maybe immediately after it came out, or a year after or so, in early 2000. Because that was the first time I was really exposed to a lot of those statistics over the world. I don't remember exactly what worldview I had, but I think it was not super optimistic. But then in your book, I saw that, okay, hundreds of millions of people have left extreme poverty. Millions and hundreds of millions of people have started living in democracies, for example. Tell us a little bit about that book. What made you write that 20 years ago?
Well, I wrote it partly because I had just learned stuff like that, and it was very eye-opening to me, because I had been very much of a pessimist about the world and the world's future, and thinking that there must have been some good old days back in the past. But then studying history, and specifically Swedish miserable history, and understand under what terrible circumstances our ancestors lived under, taught me that no, there's something else going on in the world. And we've actually seen some unprecedented progress in the last few centuries, and we cannot take that for granted. So I wanted to write about that and its preconditions. And I mean, it wasn't my own discovery. I read people like Julian Simon, who had written about this and challenging much more of the pessimism in the 1960s and 70s. But I thought, and I still think, that we need to reinforce this and remind people of that progress all the time, because otherwise we might just lose it.
Exactly, and your latest book before the current one is Progress, 10 reasons to look forward to the future. I sort of started to see a sort of a theme here in your books. Progress is part of it. 10 reasons to look forward to the future. But you also make documentaries, and since 2007 you're part of the Cato Institute. You're also a YouTuber. I heard it's very cool to be a YouTuber nowadays. And you made, as part of the series Dead Wrong, you made 172 episodes with around 10 million views. I thought we're going to look at one of them now, my favorite episode. You've ended this now, but my favorite episode is just a little bit more than a minute here. So, Max, our producer, if you can.
How do we summarize the 2010s? Many think of it as an awful decade. 10 years of horror, unfair distribution, and environmental destruction. Dead wrong. Maybe it's hard to believe this, but the overall indicators of human well-being tell another story. This was the best decade ever. Extreme poverty declined from more than 18% to less than 9% in 10 years. For the first time in human history, more than half of the world's population is now middle class. More people than ever have access to clean water, sanitation, to vaccine. Global life expectancy increased by more than 3 years in 10 years. Child mortality was reduced by a third, which means that the lives of 1.2 million children are saved annually. And they also go on to be better educated. Adult illiteracy was reduced from almost 17 to less than 14%. And I know you won't believe this, but even when it comes to the environment, we saw great progress. Death rates from indoor and outdoors pollution declined by 19%. Deaths from climate-related disasters was reduced by a third. So it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the worst of times when you read the headlines, but it was the best of times when you studied the trend lines. So happy new decade.
Yes, happy new decade, and here we are.
That's nice. It seems like I dressed better when I left my home once in a while.
Yes, precisely. So what do you think of the 2020s? Okay, not a great start, obviously, but yeah. when we summarize this decade in 10 years, what do you think will it be the best decade ever again?
Well, when I usually talk about whether, if I had a time machine, which year would I want to go to? And it's always the present year. If I'm not allowed to go into the future straight away, which would be even better. But so far, I would say I would prefer 2019 to 2010. On the other hand, if we had to have a pandemic of dramatic global proportions like this, I think 2020 is the best year to have it, because we've never had access to the kind of science, the technology, the wealth to combat the problems that we have right now. So it took us 3,000 years to get vaccines against polio and measles. Now it seems like it took us 3 months to get lots of potential drugs and vaccines that seems to be working fairly well. We'll see. So it tells me that we're still on the right road when it comes to the basics of it, when it comes to science, technology, and wealth.
Yeah, precisely. I wrote an article early in this pandemic, and I thought one of the things I wrote about, I said we're probably going to see us moving forward really fast in some areas, vaccines, for example. And we see some great examples of that. The people in Oxford working with AstraZeneca, someone compared it to walking in empty-handed into a shed and coming out with a jet engine. That's what they've done in 3 or 4 months now. It's some amazing projects. Of course, it sucks that it had to be a global pandemic to do that, but still, we've seen some really positive things out there. Okay, let's now instead focus on your new book, Open, the story of human progress. So, what is the general thesis of this book?
Yes, as you pointed out previously, you seem to notice some sort of common denominator, some plot that I keep returning to. And it's, like many of the authors back here, this is the fiction section, they always seem to return to something that was incredibly important to them, their childhood or a specific love affair or something like that. Well, to me, it's the discovery of human progress, because that's such an eye-opener to realize that I had been ungrateful about all the things that actually keeps me alive. I with the kind of health conditions and the kind of nutrition available 200-300 years ago, I would not have been alive today. So I keep returning to that. What I do this time around is that I'm trying to explain historically why we have this progress, how it's dependent on openness in various ways. Open societies, open minds, open migration, open trade, because all the great things that have made our lives better and given us more opportunities are the result of things that seem strange and often provocative and controversial initially. So it could only happen in open societies where people were allowed to experiment with things that others thought crazy. So I look at historical episodes from actually ancient Mesopotamia and onwards, and look at the periods that we now think of as golden eras, that we saw rapid innovation, rapid growth in knowledge and in productivity. And they all have this common denominator, that it happened because they were, relative to other cultures at that time, much more open. But I also explain why we're so uncomfortable with it, because openness gives us everything except certainty, or the appearance of certainty, that we know what we'll get eventually. So it always gives an opening for demagogues, for authoritarians, for churches and what have you, to say that, look, we don't want this uncertainty, we want something predictable, and I'll give you predictable by basically dismantling liberties, opportunities, openness. And that has also happened historically in many, many different eras. And that's why we have to be concerned about that, because we can't take these institutions for granted. Right.
One of the examples that I really enjoyed reading about, I read a little bit about it in other books, and that's China. And sort of the question, the big question, at least for us in Europe, why did the Industrial Revolution happen in England and in Europe? And China makes an interesting case because, like you write, sort of not 10,000, but 1,000 years ago, most of humanity's progress we've seen was in China. They were far ahead of England and Europe. So they were open for a couple of hundred years, and then they closed. And now we've seen it open again, at least parts of it closed during Mao, and then open again under Deng Xiaoping. But first, let's go back in history. Can you describe China 1,000 years ago, and during those hundreds of years, and the openness, relative openness then?
Yes, this is another thread in my book that's important. So I'm glad you raised it, because when I learned history, I did it in reverse originally. We have this thing now, which is a world led, at least a couple of years ago, from a few countries in North America and Northern Europe. And then, so why did this happen? Why did we begin to create this wealth, this technological superiority, these liberal democracies in this part of the world, and then trying to find where it came from, the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, back to the Greeks, and so on. What surprised me when I really started learning history was that we've had many different golden eras throughout history, efflorescences, periods when suddenly we had a great burst of productivity and creativity in various places. And that's important. It's not a particular culture, it's not a particular country or ethnicity. It's the places that happen to have relatively more openness than others. And one of the most impressive episodes of efflorescence historically is China 1,000 years ago under the Song dynasty. 1,000 years ago, they navigated on ocean ships with the nautical compass. They read books printed with movable type, and they fought with gunpowder. And they are the three inventions that Karl Marx, writing in the 1860s, credited with having created Western capitalism. But apparently they were there before. And why was that? Why did we have that burst of creativity back then? Well, because Song China was more open than other places. It was open to other cultural influences. They invited back traders, intellectuals, scientists from all parts of the world, writers, merchants. So they all met in China, exchanged ideas and competed with one another so that they saw new combinations appearing, and that resulted in something interesting. They had more openness to trade, they had more secure property rights for the farmers, so they began to innovate when it came to better high-yielding crops and with new distribution systems, and even things like paper money, so that they could facilitate trade in various ways. And many historians who look at Song China back then, 1,000 years ago and 900 years ago, saying that they were close to getting into some sort of intellectual enlightenment and to an industrial revolution, because they produced more iron than the whole of Europe did until the 18th century. They began to innovate with textile machinery, and they had a very open intellectual debate, combining, comparing, and debating various ideas in a way that we didn't see in Europe until the Enlightenment, I would say.
Exactly, and I think this is so important. I'm sort of embarrassed that I didn't know these things, I'm sort of embarrassed for myself that I haven't learned them, but I also a little bit embarrassed about Swedish education. Why didn't I learn this in school? We have a very Eurocentric perspective here. So, and then of course you start thinking, okay, and then it's very easy to start thinking, okay, but maybe we are a little bit superior. They seem to go backwards, and it's an easy thing to start thinking, but when you realize, okay, they were far ahead of us, and like you say, every place you see openness, then you understand, okay, it's the openness, it's not whatever other things going on there that is the main source of that creativity, and So we have a slide here with a quote. You said parts of it. See if Max can get up. Exactly. 1,000 years ago, when Europe was considered so much of a backwater, then much of it was not even worth raiding. then you're really in the backwater. The Chinese already navigated with nautical compass, read books printed with movable type, and fought with gunpowder, the three inventions that Karl Marx, writing in the 1860s, credited with having ushered in Western capitalism. So exactly. And the next slide, Max, the background to this image is the Great Wall. Sort of this, for me, this symbolizes what happened next in China. Instead of keeping things open, they focused high tech, sure, in that, but focused that high tech on building a huge wall. What happened after the Song dynasty?
Yeah, unfortunately, they came up with the idea that they had to make China great again by returning to some sort of mythical past before they had all this openness, and that destroyed it all. It was a long period of certain difficulties in various ways. They were invaded by Mongols. That didn't really ruin it, because Kublai Khan, when it came to China, realized that, look, this seems like a prosperous, nice place. It's actually much better than back home. So so we inherited, in a way, that tradition of openness in China as well, and kept it afloat. Then, unfortunately, they faced a serious pandemic, and this was the Black Death, even worse than our version. It led to a massive loss of life, but it also led to trade routes being abandoned and much of the wealth creation destroyed in and around China. And this is also a pattern that I notice in my book, that in times of crisis, there's an opening for dramatic change. Unfortunately, often for the worst, because at least when you have severe crises like Great Depressions, invasions, natural disasters, pandemics in open societies, you see this dramatic loss, at least short term, in life, health, wealth, and it creates this societal fight or flight instinct. When you think you have to, with our Stone Age brain, sort of fight the enemy, you have to pick scapegoats and foreigners and pick fights with them, or hide behind walls and tariff barriers. And that's something that happened in the decades after the Black Death. We began to see in many places, many parts of the world, a resurgence of ideas, religious and political ideas, that they should return to some sort of mythical past when they weren't exposed to dangers like they did now. And this happened in Mongol China by having the Mongols saying, no, we've become too much of Chinese, so we have to return to our roots, which created the opposite reaction among the Chinese, so that they began to think that we shouldn't have any Mongols here. This created tensions and civil strife and a Ming revolution, an ethnic Chinese revolution, which were built on several different ideas. One of them being that after what they saw as this humiliation of being conquered by Mongols, we have to return to something else. We shouldn't be as open to outsiders and trade. And the Ming idea was to protect what we have. And that entailed building the Great Wall to keep the foreigners out and start trade wars with everybody else. So they abandoned their ocean-going ships. They banned ocean-going ships, and the greatest armada that the world had ever seen, the one that discovered the world, was abandoned, was rotting, and some of the great ships were even burnt. And even the records of these great journeys that they've had were burned, so that no one would be interested in repeating the trick. And things that they didn't understand, the mechanical clocks that were left in the great palaces, they were destroyed. The new science was destroyed. The Muslim astronomers were thrown out so that they didn't get the knowledge about the world and how the skies worked anymore, and the heavens worked. So all of this meant that they lost what made China great originally, and today 500 years of stagnation instead.
Exactly. For me, that's when we talk about make the future come sooner, that we want to move forward. That is exactly why, because if we stop, then you don't just conserve what you got, you actually destroy what you got. You start moving backwards. There's no standing still, really. You have to move forward to sort of be great. You can't stand still. Standing still is the same as going backwards. Do you agree?
That's an incredibly important point. And I often hear this being said by both nostalgics who think that we should return to this mythical past that didn't exist back then, at least when we read the historical records, or some sort of stationary ideal. Look, aren't we sufficiently comfortable now? Shouldn't we just quit while we're ahead? And the problem with all of that is that, as you put it, standing still is to go backwards for several reasons. One of them being that we will always be surprised by new things, new problems, pandemics or supervolcanoes or what have you. And therefore, we need to build new knowledge and technology to deal with that. But another one is also pushback. Whenever we solve problems, we also create new problems. We've managed to almost eradicate human hunger. It used to be some 90% of the world living in chronic undernourishment. Now it's around 10%. But of course, that creates obesity. Or we kill bacteria with antibiotics, but that creates antibiotic resistance as well in certain germs. So we always have to keep on working, keep on creating, and keep on searching for new solutions, even to stand still. Everything else is going backwards.
Yeah, precisely. Speaking of the past, I just remembered another thing you write about in the book, the Pessimist Archive, that podcast that we both love. It's a podcast about things we used to be afraid of, whatever it is. If it's the Sonic Walkman, oh my God, things are going to turn really ugly now, and people walk around listening to music all the time, and they don't see what's going on, and bicycles and butter, and everything that we've been afraid of, and you laugh when you listen to it, because how can people be so stupid being against all these things? It's crazy. And then you hear the exact same arguments over current technology or new technology. But in one of the episodes, the one you write about, he tried to find out, when it was better before in the 70s or in the 50s or in the 20s. Every generation thought it was better before, and he keeps just going back in time. So when was the best time?
I love that episode, and but actually, I have a new favorite episode every time he's done a new one. But that's such a wonderful story, because that's what you want to ask anyone who's nostalgic about the world and talking about the good old days, like I used to in the past. So when was that? And let's look at that era. And the great thing about that episode is that when Americans say, well, the 1950s, is that he talks to historians of the 1950s, asking them, what did people in the 1950s think about the world then? Was it the good old days? Obviously not. It was awful. Rising crime, racial tensions, riots, the threat of instant nuclear annihilation. They longed for the 1920s instead. And talking to historians of the 1920s, they were say that people were worried about the radio would make us crazy. The kids were going crazy through car culture and things like that. So they longed for the 1890s and backwards in time all the time. And one pattern that I notice is that it's often some 30 years ago, the good old days. When you ask people, so you can pick any era in human history when life wasn't as difficult as today, when we lived in harmony with one another and nature, when was that? And it's almost always the era in which people think that the best music was created as well, namely in their youth. and that seems to be because when we're young, life is exciting, but at the same time it's safe because you've got parents there to look after you, and in most instances. But then you grow older, and then you have to worry about the world, and you get kids, and you have bills to pay, and you have to think about everything that can go wrong. And then you begin to think that, there must have been something better than this in the past. And that's natural. I think that the best music was created in 1984 to 1987, basically. Depeche Mode and Sisters of Mercy, and nothing like that will ever be created again. But I have learned not to confuse my own personal nostalgia with a societal, political nostalgia, the one that's often abused by politicians who tell us that we'll bring the whole society back into those good old days, because then it gets very dangerous. Partly because it's all mythological. It wasn't. You can't return to that country because it's not there and it never was. But also because then it's all a matter of removing things that have happened since. It's a matter of removing influences, innovations, technologies, the culture, things that have changed and that we don't understand because we're getting older. And that's the very thing that undermines societies historically.
Exactly, and then it could be really dangerous. But he ends up in old Mesopotamia, right? The good old days was in old Mesopotamia, but then back then they thought it was earlier. What I don't know what age, but
it's wonderful. It keeps going back, and then suddenly ancient Mesopotamia, realizing that fairly soon after mankind invented the written language, we started writing about how nowadays everything is awful, but because the kids, they don't obey the parents, the politicians, they're corrupt, and the businessmen are ripping us off. Let's go back to the good old days.
Before written language.
So it's not you, the world, it's us. It's you and me. It's our own psychology. And that's why I think it's so important not to care too much about headlines, but instead follow trend lines. Because we all think that now everything is a little bit scary and uncertain, but every generation has thought so, because every generation has had the same predicament. We don't know how to solve present problems, but we know that our ancestors solved previous problems, because that's why we're here. So that's why every period that we're in will seem like the most dangerous one in so many ways. And that's why we shouldn't trust our gut instinct. We should instead look to statistics and history to find out something more than just our own perception.
Precisely. Yeah, we have to fight our own sort of urges or our own psychology in this. Exactly. Okay, let's go back to the story of human progress that we were on. So the Industrial Revolution did not happen in China, but it could definitely have happened, the Chinese version of the Industrial Revolution. Instead, it happened in England and in Europe. Why?
Because of luck. We got lucky. And this, again, I think is an important counter to the kind of Eurocentric perspective that we've often been taught historically, that there must have been something about the quality of people or our beliefs or our rulers in this particular part of the world which made it happen here. But actually, when you go back in history, you see that these periods of these golden eras appear in various places, and they could have been Confucians or Muslims or Catholics or Calvinists. It has happened in so many places. But one common denominator is that the rulers always fought it. Eventually, there have been forces that have felt that innovation threatened their rule, could be their political power, or it could be their economic, the rents that they got for one reason or another. And what set Europe apart was not that, because we had churches and kings and nobles who fought every innovation, from textile machines to the steam engine to Enlightenment ideals. They fought it just as fiercely as the rulers did in the Middle East and in China. The difference was that they were bad at it in Europe. They failed. Europe failed, as one historian, Patricia Cohn, has put it. Europe failed. That's why we got this far. Had Europe succeeded in creating stability, then Europe would also have remained a pre-industrial society. The difference was that Europe was much more divided in several different ways. We were more geographically divided: rivers, mountain ranges, peninsulas and peninsulas on peninsulas, and different churches fighting for superiority, and 400 or 500 different political entities, and independent cities and churches and universities, which meant that in China, when the Ming Emperor said that, no, let's have no more ocean-going trade, that was the end of it for an entire continent, because that's how far his rule extended. But when the Spanish king or an Italian noble said the same thing, it only meant that someone like Columbus, for example, could go to someone else and ask the King of France or the King of England to sponsor his attempt to find a westward route to India. And he was rejected again, but he could keep going until then that the Spanish royals actually, after a very long period of hesitation, agreed. And that's what we saw with almost any scientific discovery or any technological innovation that made the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution possible. They were rejected by guilds and the ancient trade unions and nobles and churches, but then they could always find an escape, a refuge across the border and try their luck over there. And if you have 500 different political entities, the chances that you don't synchronize and coordinate repression in a perfect way. So what's banned in one place could be accepted somewhere else. So, Hugo Grotius could go from the Netherlands to France to write his stuff. And Descartes could go from France to the Netherlands to write his stuff, because repression wasn't coordinated. So we got a plurality of ideas and of innovations in Europe that didn't happen in more centralized places. And therefore, those new things like a great textile machine or a steam engine or a steam boat that was destroyed in a certain place could survive in another place. And then kings and nobles, because they weren't stupid, they wanted to extract as much wealth as possible from people, they realized that those who were a little bit more open to those innovations, they got a more prosperous realm and they could steal even more from them. So they began to open up, not because they liked openness, but because they could see that whenever they, we'll call it the Tarkin theory of development, Tarkin in Star Wars, the more you tighten your fist, the more star systems will slip through your fingers, as Princess Leia puts it. And that's what kings and nobles and churches realized in Europe. The more they tightened their fist, the more they destroyed dissidents and eccentric innovators, the more they undermined their own power, because the neighbors got richer, they got the refugees, and they got the innovations, and they got the wealth. So they had to open up to keep up.
So, yeah, it seems like decentralization of power is really important for openness, but to sort of let ideas live on and create new ideas and new knowledge and things like that. That's why I'm so super optimistic about the future, because now we have a global network where we can exchange ideas and about things. But in a society like that, back then, I think the kings and queens and feudal lords and everything, they were really annoyed that people could, go somewhere else and still get their way. And today, of course, it's messy and it's kind of annoying sometimes that, there's so many different opinions and it seems like we should have control over this, But how do you think we should handle this mess? Because creativity is messy and like I said, annoying. And sometimes, because there are opinions out there you don't agree with, and some of them are dangerous, of course, also, but how do you think we should handle it today with the internet and all this? All these ideas and opinions out there.
Yeah, this is problematic because we have this double nature. We are open to cooperation. We are experts in cooperation. Human beings, we've learned how to make use of the brains and the skills and the ideas of everybody else. And this has got us this far. And I agree, that's why I am super optimistic, because never before have so many people been given so much education and access to opportunities. So there are more people to learn from than ever before. And that will, by just the law of statistics, supply us with more progress in the future. But obviously we have this other tendency that we are fearful about it when it looks messy, when it looks chaotic. And if more people express themselves, we have more stupid ideas as well. And more stupid people talk all the time as well. And that is very disturbing to us, because we also want this certainty, this guarantee that things will turn out for the best. And I think that one of the and we've always fought this historically. The kings and nobles, they were very disturbed about everything and they wanted to stop it. And that's the case today as well. I think a great majority hates a great majority of all the things that are being said. That's the price of freedom, but that's not the way it feels. It feels problematic. And especially, I think, people worry too much about filter bubbles. I don't think we are in more filter bubbles than we've been before, when people had one newspaper that followed their and dictated their political line in in the household and they never heard about anything else. I think we have the opposite problem. We get everybody else in our face all the time with contrary opinions. And that, I think, to our Stone Age brain, this feels a little bit like an invasion. It feels like someone is there with dangerous ideas, threatening to undermine everything that we're doing. And they're in our social media flows all the time. They're not in your tribe, but they're in your face. And that scares us, and we then become even more tribal, and we think that they are the worst of the worst, and we have to fight them. We have to overcome that instinct. And I think there are many different ways of doing that, but just one of them being don't pay too much attention to crazy stuff. 99% of everything is shit, as one famous literary critic once put it, when people complained about, was it science fiction literature that 99% of it is? Yeah, that's the case with most stuff in the world. But that's exactly why we need so many experiments, why we need so much diversity to get those golden nuggets out of the messy stuff over there. But that doesn't mean that you have to pay attention to all of the bad stuff that are being done there when everybody can express themselves. Have you recently considered, or you, the audience, considered how much time you suddenly spend on being angry with people that you didn't even know existed 5 minutes ago? That, I think, happens when we haven't learned how to use social media. We think that everything is important there because it used to be that information was something that we needed. Any way of understanding something about the world gave us a survival advantage, so that we're hungry and thirsty for it. But now we've got an excess supply of everything, which means that we pay so much attention to everything that seems dramatic or interesting. But it's usually someone that you have never heard of in a city that you cannot even pronounce the name of, who has been stupid or sexist, or who explain that anyone who votes like you are probably retarded or something like that. Yeah, they always thought that. It's just that you never heard them say that before. So if you didn't bother 10 years ago, don't bother now. Pay attention to the important stuff that teaches you something new, that you need to understand the world better.
Yeah, and I think it's very important, like you say, and also not. We at least with some cases like fake news, we have a tendency, or at least the media that maybe feel threatened by these, they have a tendency to exaggerate that. Oh, there's so much fake news. The biggest fake news is about fake news. Of course, there are fake news out there, real fake news. No discussion. There is, but. We talk so much about fake news, so we think there's much more than it actually is. So you sort of exaggerate for yourself, and like you say, you get annoyed or angry or scared or whatever it is for something that's maybe a minor thing, but the effect is instead that you get scared for something that if you just ignored it, it wouldn't have been a thing at all. But some sort of
that's an incredibly important point, because I think that right now, one of the reasons why politics is so brutal and there's this partisan aggression going on, especially in the US, but all over the world. And that's because everybody on the left think that everybody on the right is a Trumpist QAnon conspiracy theorist, and everybody on the right think that every leftist is a violent rioter. But they're 1/millionth, or well, perhaps that's a bit optimistic, but there are a few crazy people like that, whereas the great majority is the exhausted majority who just tunes out when things get crazy like that. So couldn't we perhaps get our attention and the media attention to pay more attention to the exhausted majority that actually makes the world work, rather than those who just crave attention by being as stupid as possible?
Yeah, precisely. But another sort of model that I see some people feel they're scared by it, maybe, but they're also intrigued by it because they've been to a visit in China and they see some great project there. Maybe the Chinese tell them, we went there, we saw this, experiment in the city, and it was great. And now we built 100 of those in 12 months. People think, wow, there's no way we can compete with this. They have so much power, and when they decide to do something, they really do it, and they do, because it doesn't matter if some lives get lost or so the humans in the way. They don't care about that. But I've started to say to people that yes, China is a very powerful country. It is much more powerful now, of course, because they open up a bit. But that model won't be super successful. It could still drive them forward for a while. But that kind of, when you try to control, we can try to control people and control their thinking. If other countries remain open, like the US and Europe and all other parts of the world, the Chinese will not dominate this earth. Of course, there's more than 1 billion of them. So, of course, everything they do will have a big impact on the world. But in the long run, if we see it as a competition, they won't win, so to speak. That model won't win. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I absolutely agree with your assessment. What has happened in China is incredibly impressive, and it is, as you say, it's a result of them beginning to open up in certain ways, much more than used to be the case in the 1960s and 70s and so on. And that's created some impressive development. And everything will look dramatically big when you're 1.4 billion people. So that's one of the reasons why it will look impressive. I would guess that kind of change and wealth creation, that's real and it is impressive. But you actually had people saying something similar about the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 60s. And that's a little bit more of propaganda, and that people didn't really understood what happened in the Soviet Union at that time. But there's a kernel of truth, and that is that they could see what happened in successful Western societies, that these are the goods and services that people want and that will create wealth in the future. So let's just put lots of farmers into factories producing that. And you can do that with a fairly authoritarian model, and that will create impressive growth numbers, and you'll see lots of wealth being created in that way. And I think that that's not exhausted yet for China. They can keep on doing that, even though they find it difficult to do it with their big state-owned enterprises. They really need more entrepreneurs to do it. But the problem that Soviet Russia ran into is the one that will haunt China as well. That you can imitate if you know exactly what you're supposed to do. You can build a command economy if you command people to the right place. But the problem is that eventually those opportunities are exhausted. The low-hanging fruit is already picked. And then you need that growth to come from somewhere else. And that comes from innovation and from strange new entrepreneurial ideas. And, the Soviet Union missed the personal computer because they just didn't see the point. They thought it was better to invest in more steel and wheat instead. And I think that the same thing is going to happen in China as well. They are very good when they know what to do. Then they're very good at telling businesses what to do and to direct investment toward those firms and so on. But when that's done, when what they don't like is the strange surprises and the crazy stuff being done. I read the same edition of The Economist a couple of years ago, last year perhaps, two different stories that to me highlighted this in a dramatic fashion. Unrelated stories. One of them was about an American entrepreneur who said that China is wonderful. There's much less regulation here if you want to start businesses and produce. It's great. They'll have the future in their hands. And that's true if the Chinese really want that firm to really do this thing in a big way. Then in certain ways, China is now more deregulated than many Western economies. But the other story told the opposite story. And that was a tech business in China that recently took one of their apps down from the App Store, various app stores, and explained that they hadn't realized that this broke traditional socialist ideals, and they apologized to the government for having done so, because this was a strange, surprising way of using their creativity, which the Politburo didn't like, and then they just banned it. And China's future depends on which side is going to win out in the end. And so far, the Politburo and the Communist Party are not comfortable with surprises and real innovation, for obvious reasons, because that would threaten their power in the long run. But if they don't, they won't lead the world in the future, because the next industrial and digital revolution is going to come from the surprises, and only societies that are open to them will benefit from it.
Spot on, really spot on. You have an example here in the book that I haven't heard about before, but I checked it out after I read about it. It's called Innocentive. Tell us what that is. It's something really interesting, I think.
Oh, yes. Innocentive is an amazing place. That's where you go to if you are NASA, for example, or a big multinational manufacturing firm, and you have a problem that frustrates you because you haven't been able to solve it. And what you do then is that you go to a platform like Innocentive for open solutions, open problem solving, where you define your problem, you explain your problem, and open it up for the rest of the world to see. And then you attach a certain reward. So if you solve this for us, you'll get $100,000 or something like that. And when I study Innocentive, what surprises me are two things. First of all, how many of the problems are being solved in a very rapid way. It doesn't take long. Something that has frustrated the best astronomers at NASA for a long time can suddenly be solved in a matter of days when the rest of the world has a look. And that tells you something about how there's strength in numbers and there's strength in more eyeballs looking at the world's problems. And that's one of the most important reasons why openness creates progress. But the other thing that surprised me, or perhaps it didn't surprise me because it fit perfectly with my theories about openness, was that those who solve the problem they come from another field entirely. They are people who haven't got the same expertise as you're supposed to have to deal with these problems. So suddenly you have people solving astronomical problems because they are radio engineers. Someone who solves a chemical problem is not a chemist, but someone who works in an entirely unrelated field. And that tells you something else important. And that is that, the world is one and a whole. It's not really divided in disciplines, but our way of learning about the world is. So just like that old story about the three blind travelers who touch the elephant and think it feels like a snake or a wall or what have you, you have to compare notes. You need different perspectives, people coming from different fields of expertise to really understand the world. And that's something that Innocentive has proved. And according to two researchers who looked at it, it's even the chance of solving a problem improves if you're far away from that particular field. You need some knowledge of it, obviously, but you use other theories and knowledges that are related to this sphere, but haven't been tried and used thus far. And that's another reason why openness is so important, because you often get the great innovations when you combine ingredients that we already had, but they were in different places and you had to begin to combine them.
Exactly. And I think in this in Innocentive, you see sort of the secret of innovation. It's there. And for my all-time favorite book, The Wisdom of Crowds by James Surowiecki, he shows what amazing things groups of people can achieve. Small groups and big groups. But the most important thing is that everyone in the group thinks independently and puts forward their viewpoint, because that's what that's what creates new ideas and new ways of attacking a problem or whatever it is. And it's so it's really interesting to see this in real life in a model using the internet and those kind of incentives to solve problems. And this is hard. It's easy in theory, but in practice it's not so. You don't always feel very comfortable having it. Working together with people with very different viewpoints on the thing. You think, can't this guy just shut up? I'm always here. And then you realize, okay, maybe that's a very good perspective. The two of us, coming together here. So I think really that's the sort of secret in innovation. And of course, you need openness for that. Otherwise, it's impossible.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's why, one of the nicest things you can say about someone is that it's like a soulmate. Oh, he thinks exactly like I do, because that's so incredibly comfortable, obviously, and we feel confirmed in all our beliefs. But that's really just like having a copy of yourself. That doesn't help you that much. It's the uncomfortable troublemakers who help us to see things in a different way, and that's very, very difficult lesson to learn. Just look at the political debate. We have a sort of a left at universities and in streets trying to engage in cancel culture against ideas that they disapprove of, and a right wing that also approves of the cancel culture, but also migrants and people who come here with another culture and different ways of looking at the world. So let's just reject them. So much of politics is about removing all that diversity. While if you look at all the great things we have that makes our lives comfortable today, they all come from those troublemakers. And but it's difficult.
Yeah, definitely is. Okay, to the last question. We're coming up to an hour here. Like I said, we want to make the future come sooner. Well, one of the things I realized is that there's very few positive visions of the future. You look in, Star Trek being an obvious exception, but if you look in culture like that, there's more dystopic futures. Makes great movies, books, and of course, great drama. And you also see some negative visions of the world in parts of the environmental movements that want to move us backwards. But at least they have a vision of what they want to achieve. And like in many cases, there's, of course, they have some good points in there, but I think the general direction would be catastrophic for humanity. So we've started asking people what their vision for the world is, a positive vision for the world. What do you think? So I'm asking you, Johan, what is your vision for the world and for humanity? What do you want us to see us achieve?
Oh, that's fairly simple. I would just like to, remove all health problems and have eternal life and abolish extreme poverty and hunger. But that's an outcome. How do we get there? And I guess you're pointing to something like that. And then I'd say something that would improve the world in various ways is to remove distance in every way. And that sounds difficult, but that's actually what we do now when we have this digital meeting like this. Suddenly we've removed the distance between us and we can exchange ideas and thoughts like this. I'd like to see, and that's the key to all kinds of exchanges and all ways of learning from others and make use of their solutions and their knowledge and so on. But we need to do that in a physical sense as well. Do it through transport in various ways, but I think there's too much talk about sort of flying cars. We'll have flying cars soon, but I don't really see the point. It's more like, how do we make sure?
That's where we disagree.
Okay.
Finally, something to disagree about.
No, I think we need to some sort of technology where we beam people to certain places, go straight to that solution instead. And how do we do this physically? Because transport technology is one of the few things in Star Trek that I don't really believe in. It seems to me more like we're killing someone and create a replica of that person somewhere else. And I'm not sure that too many people want to do that. But I think there are ways 3D printing, where we'll get to a solution fairly soon with unlimited cheap energy, where we can just produce the kind of goods we need when we need them in a certain place, more like the replicator technology in Star Trek. Perhaps with versions of augmented reality or holodeck solutions, we can create not just this kind of digital meeting, but an actual physical place, or at least it will feel like it, with holographic technology and force fields and so on, where we can suddenly step into any kind of region anywhere and then produce the kind of tools and technologies that we need in that place. Moving towards removing distance, I think, would make us come closer and therefore also multiply ideas and solutions to all our problems.
Right, very nice. Yeah, the holodeck, that's the technology I'm looking for most. That would be amazing. I would spend a lot of time in there, unfortunately.
Yeah, and then immediately people will say this is the worst thing ever, because we all get holodeck addicted, and then the kids, they don't read Marcel Proust anymore. They just go straight into the machine. Exactly. So we'll always have pessimism.
A new episode of Pessimist's Archive. Exactly. All right. Thank you so much for this discussion and for your new book, Johan, Open, the Story of Human Progress. Thank you for talking to us.
Thank you so much. That was great fun.
Thanks. All right. The next Warp show is on September the 24th. Then we're going to talk about the energy revolution. There's a lot of disruption going on in the energy sector from many different angles. It's a perfect storm right now. And we're going to talk with the CEO of Tibber, a company, Norwegian and Swedish energy company that are part of this disruption. We're going to talk with their CEO and founder about what Tibber is doing, but more on what is happening in the energy sector. So many things going on, so many opportunities to think new and for clean energy going forward. So if you don't want to miss that, subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you are watching this on YouTube now, you just click subscribe. Otherwise, you go to youtube.com/Warp Institute and you can subscribe there. Also, to not miss future episodes, but also make sure you get these fact-based optimistic news to balance a lot of the negative headlines out there. Head to warpinstitute.org or warpinstitute.se for Sweden and sign up to our free newsletter. Once a week, you get a dose of fact-based optimism in your inbox. So that's it for today, for this episode. Thank you so much for listening and watching. And please make sure you buy and read Johan's book. It's really good. Open, the Story of Human Progress. Thanks so much for watching. Bye. And make the future come sooner.